for you? Meaty. As someone joked when I was describing our speakers tonight, it sounds like a TED Talk. But I think you're going to find it very interesting. So with no further ado, we'll get started. Our first reader tonight is Tom Glenn. Tom has worked as an intelligence operative, a musician, a linguist. He speaks 7 languages, a cryptologist, a government executive, and, I have to put my glasses on, a caregiver for the dying. Always a writer. For 13 years, he shuttled between the US and Vietnam on covert intelligence assignments before being evacuated under fire when Saigon fell. He's a reviewer for the Washington Independent Review of Books, where he specializes in books on war and Vietnam. His Vietnam novel and stories, Friendly Casualties, is now available on Amazon. His article describing the fall of Saigon and his role in it was published in the Baltimore Post-Examiner as a 3-installment article in August and September of last year. And Apprentice House of Baltimore just brought out his novel, No Accounts. Tom has books here this evening, so if you like what you hear, you can buy a copy of one of his books. Please welcome Tom Glenn.
First click, please. Đây là những tin tức của những nơi quay kỳ phát thanh từ thủ đô Washington. Those are words I listen to every day. The voice of America in Vietnamese. I listen to the BBC, I listen to American radio service, anything I could hear to keep track of what was going on. April 1975, I was in Saigon waiting for the North Vietnamese to attack. Second click, please. One more. Okay. My name is Tom Glenn. My work in Vietnam was signals intelligence. I was intercepting and exploiting the communications of the North Vietnamese as they invaded South Vietnam. I was employed by the National Security Agency, but my connection with NSA and my name were classified. Now, after 39 years, my work has been declassified, so I can tell you what happened. Next click, please. Since the middle of March of 1975, I had known that Saigon was going to fall. I put aside my 2 major missions, which were advising the ambassador, Graham Martin, on things that were going to come. Next clip, please. And assisting the government of South Vietnam in their own signals intelligence effort, and worked on getting my people out of the country. I couldn't tolerate the idea that any of them would be killed or wounded when the attack came. I had 43 men working for me. Their wives and their children were living in Saigon. My wife and my children were living in Saigon. I could not tolerate the idea any of them would be killed or wounded. I wanted those people out of there now. But the ambassador, Graham Martin, next click please, refused to allow me to evacuate my people. He didn't believe the evidence I was giving him that the North Vietnamese were going to attack Saigon. He cited communications deception on the part of the North Vietnamese. I was stymied. My boss, the director of NSA, General Lou Allen, sent me a message ordering me to close down the operation, get everybody out before somebody got killed. The ambassador wouldn't hear of it. So I made him a proposition. I said, look, let my people go, and I will stay with a skeleton crew so that you can get the communications from Washington, D.C. about the North Vietnamese, keep on getting the intelligence. He turned me down. So I cheated. I used every ruse I could think of to get my people out of the country. Some I had to give a direct order to go because they didn't want to leave me behind. Some I sent out on phony home leave, others on fake business travel, and still others on trumped-up vacations. Anything I could think of to get them out of the country. And toward the end, I took money from my own pocket. I bought a ticket on Pan Am, and with no orders, no authorization, I put a guy on the airplane and told him to go. That turned out to be the last Pan Am flight out of Saigon. I moved out of the villa that I had shared with my wife and my 4 children after they got out of Saigon on a supposed visit to Bangkok for a vacation. And I moved out to my office on the northern edge of Saigon at Tan Son Nhut. Tan Son Nhut was both a commercial airport and a military base. And my office was in a very large compound that housed the MACV building, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam building, which by then had been taken over by the Defense Attaché office. I slept on a cot in front of my desk between the two flags that stood on both sides, the Stars and Stripes and the flag of the Republic of South Vietnam. I slept with a .38 under my pillow. I knew I had to stay to the end. First of all, the ambassador wasn't going to let me go. But beyond that, it was going to take a lot of time to get all those people out of the country, especially since I was doing it under false pretenses. And beyond them, there were 2,700 South Vietnamese that had worked with my organization over the years. I was determined to get those people evacuated because I knew how cruel the North Vietnamese would be to them if they captured them. Since I knew I had to stay, I asked for 2 volunteers to stay with me. The guys in my comm shop mostly demurred, saying they were family men, they didn't feel that they could risk their lives because of their wives and their children. I thought that was a perfectly reasonable way to look at it. Then 2 brave men stepped forward. I can tell you their names now, they've been declassified. Gary Hickman was the communications maintenance man, and the communicator was Bob Hartley. I explained to Bob and Gary the danger as I understood it. I didn't know if we'd have electricity, I didn't know if we'd be bombarded. They understood the danger and they agreed to stay with me. As long as I live, I will love those 2 men for their raw courage. They risked their lives because I asked them to. Next clip, please. And one more clip. I didn't know how much longer I'd be able to get out and get through the city. The streets of Saigon were becoming jammed with refugees as they flowed into the city to try to escape from the North Vietnamese that were closing in on all sides. But there were several trips I had to make. I'll tell you about one of them. I went to see a South Vietnamese officer that I had worked with over the years, a man for whom I had great respect and admiration, a true professional in the signals intelligence business. I had to go see him at his office because I had to tell him where he and his men should go once the evacuation order was given. That was not something I could discuss on an open telephone line. When I arrived, he, the soul of Asian politeness, welcomed me in. He sat me down, he served me tea. He told me that his wife, who worked for USAID, United States Agency for International Development, had been offered the opportunity to take her family and leave the country. That included him, but he wouldn't go. No evacuation order had been given, and he wasn't going to abandon his troops. And if he wasn't going to go, she wasn't going to go, so there they were, a husband and a wife and their 3 children still sitting in Saigon. And I said to him, what are you going to do when North Vietnamese tanks are rolling in the streets? He said to me, I cannot live under the communists. When the communists come, I will shoot my 3 children, I will shoot my wife, and I will shoot myself. That officer didn't escape at the end. I have no doubt that he carried out his plan because so many other South Vietnamese officers did precisely what he described. Next clip, please. By the 27th of April, I had gotten all of my subordinates and all of the families out of the country. They were all gone. None of them were going to be killed or wounded when the attack started. Next clip, please. We were down to just the 3 of us, Bob and Gary and me. The next day, toward sunset, the 28th of April, it was getting late in the day, I went to the head, to the men's room. Pentagon East, this enormous building that we were in, it was such a beautiful building, was now in shambles. Trash and broken furniture littered the hallways, the latrines were filthy and they smelled disgusting. I was standing in front of the urinal in the men's room when the wall in front of me snapped back as if to slap me down and then snapped back into place again. Huge explosion, almost knocked me off my feet. Any sensible person at that point would have taken cover, but I was an intelligence officer, not very sensible. So instead of taking cover, I left the men's room, I went to the western side of the building, opened up the exit, unlocked it, went outside into the compound. On that side of the building wall and the fence were only about 15 feet apart. Sandbags had been piled up there to protect us from shrapnel. And the first thing I noticed was that mob that had been gathering outside the perimeter fence, 10 to 15 people deep, people begging to be evacuated, they were gone. And then I reasoned, well, of course they were. They were taking cover from whatever that explosion was. I shaded my eyes to look across the runway to see if I could figure out what that explosion had been. And my ears picked up the drone of turbojet aircraft. I looked up and I saw them. 5 A-37 Dragonfly fighters, and while I watched, they came together over the runway, they went into a dive, and they dropped bombs. That was the beginning. We were bombarded all night long. Shells fell within the compound. First rockets, then about 4 in the morning on the 29th of April, the artillery started. More shells fell within the compound. One C-130 aircraft in back of us on the runway exploded. The building next door to us was destroyed, but the worst thing that happened was that the Marines at one of our gates were hit. These were guys I had been out talking with, trading a scuttlebutt so I could keep track of what was going on. They were hit. 2 of them were killed. Their names were Judge and McMahon, and they were the last American fighting men killed on the ground in Vietnam. Before dawn, we got a message in telling us that frequent wind phase 4 had been declared. That was the code name for the evacuation. The evacuation was on. I telephoned the embassy and I said, the evacuation has been declared, get us out of here. The woman I talked to was polite, she was even gracious. She explained to me, as one does to a child, that there was nothing the embassy could do for us because we were too far away. And although I probably didn't know it, all those people in the streets, all those refugees had gone into rioting. Well, of course I knew it, I could see them. I won't repeat to you the curse I laid on her head, but her response to me was, oh, you're quite welcome. By then the Marines had landed. They were under the command of Al Gray, a Marine colonel I had worked with over the years in Vietnam. I went to Al and I said, the embassy can't get us out, can you get us out? He said, yes, I will. Right after that, we got a telephone call telling us that South Vietnamese Air Force officers had broken into the building. They had their guns out, they were demanding evacuation at gunpoint. All officers were to be cleared. We were to go instead to the evacuation staging area, which was another office that the Marines had secured. We destroyed our crypto equipment, our communications equipment. We went to that office and I begged Al Gray to get Bob and Gary out as soon as possible. After all they'd been through, I couldn't tolerate the idea that they'd be killed at this point. They went out about 2 o'clock that afternoon. I had to wait until late in the day. It was getting dark, it was raining. I was out in the compound, CH-53 helicopters were all around me. I begged Al not to put me on a helicopter until I got confirmation that Bob and Gary were safe on a ship with the 7th Fleet that was anchored out in the South China Sea. But he was having none of that. And in words I can't repeat to you, he told me to get myself on that chopper now. So I did. I was carrying the 2 flags that had stood on both sides of my desk, the Stars and Stripes, and the gold and orange banner of the now defunct Republic of Vietnam. For some reason, I didn't get on one of the big CH-53 helicopters that the Marines were using. I got on a little slick from Air America because they had been brought into the evacuation. As soon as we were airborne, I saw tracers coming at us. We took so much lead in the fuselage, I thought we were going down, but we didn't. We made it. I looked down at the city of Saigon and saw fires everywhere. As soon as we were over water, the pilot dropped us abruptly down to just over the surface of the ocean, and my stomach stayed up in the sky. He explained to me later he had to do that because the North Vietnamese had surface-to-air missiles and might try to shoot us down. He flew directly out to the 7th Fleet in the dark and in the rain, and as he approached it, he went straight to the Oklahoma City, the flagship of the 7th Fleet. Next clip, please. I'm sorry, one more. He circled and circled and circled over the ship. And finally, he went down very slowly and he landed on the floodlit helipad of the Oklahoma City. He told me later that he, a civilian pilot, had never before landed on a ship. As we got out of the helicopter, flashbulbs went off. Somebody took my .38 away from me, but I wouldn't let them have the flags. I had brought those back to the United States myself. Next clip, please. And then sailors pushed that helicopter over the side of the ship to make room for the next incoming bird. We circled for a number of days. I was in such bad shape I couldn't tell day from night anymore. Finally, we set sail for the Philippines. As soon as we got there, I got to Subic Bay. I booked a flight for Honolulu because I knew I had to go to Pearl Harbor to brief CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, on what had happened in Saigon. That briefing didn't go well. I felt like I was running a fever. I couldn't focus my eyes. My voice was giving out. I couldn't talk. And the worst thing that happened was that when I sat down, I passed out. At that point, I should have realized that something worse than exhaustion was affecting me. Because the whole time we'd been on that ship sailing in circles and finally going to the Philippines, I'd been sleeping, but I wasn't getting better, I was getting worse. Any sensible person would have gone to a doctor right then, but I didn't. I wanted to go home. I can't tell you how much I yearned just to go home. So I booked a flight for Baltimore with a stopover in San Francisco. And when I got to San Francisco, I looked for a doctor. But they were having a doctor's strike in San Francisco, so no physician would see me. Flew on to Baltimore. The next day I did get in to see a doctor. He diagnosed me with pneumonia due to sleep deprivation, muscle fatigue, and inadequate diet. Next slide, please. When I look back over this story I've told you, I realize there's some loose ends I have to tie up. Those 2,700 South Vietnamese that worked with me over the years, none of them escaped. They were all either captured or killed by the North Vietnamese. Bob and Gary, they did fine. They went back to the United States, resumed their careers. The ambassador didn't do so well. You may know that the State Department is a past master at quiet disgrace. So when the ambassador came back to Washington, he was moved from job to job within the State Department, but was never given another foreign assignment. And what about me? As a result of my work during the fall of Vietnam, the United States government gave me the Civilian Meritorious Award. That is today my most precious possession. And finally, there's one more set of facts I have to give you. Next click, please. In January 2012, the author of this book Black April. It's by George Vyeth. He was writing a book about the fall of Vietnam, and he came to interview me. He quotes me in the book, but the important thing is he told me some things I didn't know. He had North Vietnamese documents he had just gotten. He'd had them translated. They told him, and therefore told me, that on the morning of 29 April, while I sat in Tân Sơn Nhất waiting to be evacuated, the North Vietnamese 28th Regiment was preparing to attack us. As it came across the last bridge into Saigon before dawn, the bridge collapsed. The reason the bridge collapsed was that the regiment had with it tanks, and that bridge was not built to withstand the weight of tanks. So the regiment was forced to withdraw, go downstream, find another bridge that could bear the weight of those tanks, come across, Then come up to Tanzania and attack. They arrived the following morning, but then we were gone. Had they arrived on schedule, Bob and Gary and I, at best, would have been killed. But at worst, would have been killed. But at best, we would have been taken prisoner, and we would have been subjected to what the North Vietnamese did to Americans they captured during the fall of Vietnam. We would have been brutally incarcerated for at least a year and reportedly tortured, repeatedly tortured. There, but for the fall of a bridge, went I. Last click, please. Thank you.